Today I wanted to tell you about 3 things that I had to unlearn in order to move my guitar playing forward. Now, when I first started playing guitar, I was a kid of the 90s, and one of my favorite bands was Metallica. So, James Hetfield, Kirk Hammett, they were my 2 heroes, and I basically learned how to play guitar by watching and emulating those guys. Okay, let's get into it. Number 1. When I started to learn to play guitar, I tried to be very precise, which is, what you want to do. And I was learned to play with the tips of your fingers on top of the strings, which is really good, and it's good technique. It's nice and clean, and if you're playing classical guitar, that works out really, really well. And I thought, yep, okay, that's the way you did it. And I was trying to mute with my right hand, and I used to see players where it looked kind of sloppy because I knew they were playing a particular string, but their fingers were over more than just that one string, and I used to think, oh wow, that's pretty sloppy playing. And now I look back and I think, Anthony, you're an idiot. They were actually a much better player than you because they were muting their strings with their left hand as well. So that is one thing that I actually had to learn. I had to stop being as precise. Instead of putting my finger on that one string, on the tip of my finger, and try and play each note really, really cleanly, I had to learn to actually lay my fingers over a number of strings to try and mute them. Because when you're playing heavy metal or rock or something with a lot of distortion, the kind of stuff that I do, that tends to ring out. A string that rings out, it sounds really bad. If you want some nice, tight kind of metal sounds or rock sounds, you got to make sure those ringing strings don't ring. So you need to mute them. So one of the things I had to learn was, of course, to mute. So if I was playing the B string here, I would actually put my fingertips on the G string and on the E string in order to play the B string. All right. That was the first lesson that I needed to unlearn. And it took a little while to do that because when you get used to doing one thing one way, it takes a while to break that habit. Okay, so that was number 1. Lesson number 2. The second thing I had to unlearn when I first started playing guitar, I used to use this pick here, which is a Dunlop 0.6mm pick, which is actually quite thin. So if you see it there, it's quite thin. You'll also notice that it's actually quite rounded on the tip there. These days, I play with one of these, which is a John Petrucci flow pick. Now, the differences between these 2 picks, you might be able to see it there, is the orange pick is very, very thin. This is 0.6, whereas the John Petrucci pick is 2mm. Because of the thickness of the pick, this one, you'll be able to see it there, bends quite a lot. Okay, whereas the 2mm pick is absolutely rigid and does not move. Okay, this one also has a tip on it, more of a pointed tip, and this one is a little bit more rounded. This was a really good pick for me to start with. When I started learning to strum guitar, a soft pick is really, really helpful. Now, what happens is if you've got your 2 strings like this, I'll try and get it so that you can kind of see what happens. If these are my 2 strings here, and you put the pick between it, if you've got a soft pick, you can actually put this down further into between the 2 strings, and as you go across the strings, the pick will give. The pick will give and it will bend, and you'll get your string sound. Whereas if you have a rigid pick like this, if you stick your pick too far between the strings, okay, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to kind of pull it through the string. Now, if I've got a thin pick, I'm more likely to put it down to the strings further, which means that I can't play as fast because my pick is further down in the string, and it takes a little bit more pressure to kind of go through the string and then come up. Whereas when I have a pick like this, which is very pointy and has no give, right, you have to be a lot more precise in terms of where you put it in the strings, just so that it just touches and plucks the string, okay? You can't put it too deep. And what that does, it actually teaches you technique to get as little movement as possible in order to pluck that string. Now that translates into speed. So that means you can actually play very fast because you're not digging your pick right in between your strings. And I found that actually makes quite a difference in my playing. So I can play a lot faster, a lot easier with less effort. All right, credit where credit's due for this one. I got this one from Klaus Levin at guitarmastery.net. I'll put a link to the video that I watched that convinced me to change from playing with a floppy pick to a hard pick. And trust me, he does a much better job of explaining it to you than I do. Tip number 3 that I had to unlearn, bad habit, well, it might be a bad habit, it might just be one of my habits, is like I said, my guitar heroes were James Hetfield and Kirk Hammett, and they both play like this, right? They usually have their hands out and they're doing this kind of thing. Cool, they're finger out type players, okay? So that's how I learnt to play. I put my palm on the bridge so I can get the nice palm mute there, okay, and go like this. And often we plant the finger there just so you can get a little bit, you anchor it there and get some precision in order to do, your lead lines or whatnot. So that was all good. But what I did find was, because I've got a small hand, okay, we might be able to see it there, okay, I've got a pretty small hand, and when you compare it to the strings, when I've got it at the wrong angle, it doesn't actually mute all the strings. It only mutes about 5 strings, okay? I can actually mute the 6th string if I pull my pinky back a little bit, but then sometimes that B string actually slips in between that little kind of, I'm exaggerating it there a little bit, but you can see there's like a little bit of a gap there, okay? And what happens is my B string will ring out when I'm trying to do this. And so it would never really end up playing really cleanly. So I went to have a look and say, well, how do the guys mute this thing when they got small hands like me? And obviously the answer is pretty obvious when you see the 2 different ways people play. People play with their fingers out, or they play with their fingers in, okay? And what I found was trying to play with my fingers in allowed me just to put my fingers on those 2 strings. So no matter where I was, even if I got small hands, it kind of allowed me to mute those 2 strings. This took a really, really long time for me to learn to play, okay? Because when you play like 10 years in a certain way, and then you consciously decide to change your style, that takes a little bit of commitment. It is awkward. It is very awkward. But I highly recommend that if you're struggling to kind of mute your strings and get those really nice, clean string sounds, is maybe try doing the whole finger in on top of the strings technique. If you want to do some hybrid finger pricking technique as well, that's always helpful because your fingers are already down here. It's not necessarily the best way to do things. It's learning a bunch of techniques that you can use when you need it. Sometimes I do play with my finger on the guitar still. Sometimes I play with my fingers closed. But having 2 options to do what you want when you need it, getting the right tool for the job, is immensely helpful. All right, well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video today, learning about the 3 things that I had to really, really unlearn to relearn in a different way to progress my journey forward. Why don't you tell me what you had to unlearn in order to progress your journey? Doesn't even have to be guitar. I'm curious to hear some of your stories out there, something you had to stop learning or stop doing or breaking a habit in order to get better at something. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, hit like, and we'll catch you in the next one. Man, there's more edits in this video than a build battle in Fortnite.